The night of March 10, 2003, was cold and dark on Staten Island. It was the kind of ordinary evening in New York City where millions of lives move in their own orbits, totally unaware that some of those orbits are about to collide with shattering force. On a quiet, unassuming street, two men sat in an unmarked car, deep undercover. They were detectives James Nemerin and Rodney Andrews, seasoned officers of the New York City Police Department, husbands and fathers doing a dangerous job. They believed they were about to complete a deal, a routine sting operation to buy a Tech-9 handgun off the streets. But the man they were meeting had other, far more sinister plans. The air inside the car must have been thick with a quiet tension, the kind that always precedes the final moments of a risky operation. His name was Ronell Wilson, a young, ambitious member of the Bloods gang. He saw the world through a lens of street credibility and brutal survival. To him, the two men in the car were not protectors of the city. They were simply targets, an opportunity. The details of what happened next are chillingly direct. There was no prolonged struggle, no dramatic firefight. There was only betrayal and cold, calculated violence. Wilson, seated in the back of the car, made his move. He raised a gun and without hesitation shot both detectives in the back of the head. It was an execution, a final, irreversible act that would send shockwaves far beyond that lonely street, echoing through the heart of a city still healing from the wounds of 9/11. The silence that followed the gunshots was soon broken by the sound of a car speeding away. Wilson didn't just kill the officers, he stole their vehicle, leaving their bodies behind. The discovery of the slain detectives was a moment of profound horror for the NYPD. It was more than a crime. It was an assault on the very fabric of law and order, a declaration of war from the city's underworld. The news spread like a virus, first through the police precincts, then to the media, and finally into the homes of millions of New Yorkers. Two of their own had been murdered, not in a gun battle but in a calculated act of treachery. The collective grief and rage of the city were palpable, a heavy blanket of sorrow settling over the 5 boroughs. For the families of James Nemerin and Rodney Andrews, the world had irrevocably fractured. Their husbands, their fathers, had gone to work one day and would never come home. Their deaths left behind voids that could never be filled, futures that would never be realized. The city mourned with them, but from a distance. The police department, however, mourned as a family that had lost 2 of its brothers. A vow was made both publicly and in the quiet, determined conversations inside squad rooms and detective bureaus across the city. They would find the man responsible. They would bring him to justice. And for Ronell Wilson, his brief, violent grab for power had just set in motion a legal saga that would last for more than a decade. The investigation into the murders of detectives Nemerin and Andrews was swift and massive. The full weight of the NYPD and federal law enforcement descended upon Staten Island, turning over every stone, chasing every lead. It wasn't long before the trail led them to Ronell Wilson. He was arrested, but the arrest was just the beginning of a long and arduous journey through the American legal system. Because the crime involved the murder of law enforcement officers during a firearms transaction, the case was elevated to the federal level. This was a significant decision. It meant that prosecutors could seek a punishment that was, at the time, unavailable under New York state law, the death penalty. It was a clear signal of the gravity of the offense. The trial began in 2006, and the courtroom was a theater of raw emotion and grim testimony. The prosecution methodically laid out its case, painting a portrait of Ronell Wilson as a remorseless and violent gang member. They presented evidence from the crime scene, ballistics reports, and testimony from witnesses who placed Wilson at the center of the deadly plot. The jury heard the harrowing details of the undercover operation gone wrong, of the final moments of the 2 detectives. The prosecution's narrative was simple and powerful. This was not a crime of passion or a tragic mistake. It was a cold-blooded assassination carried out to gain status and steal a gun. The weight of the evidence seemed overwhelming. The defense, on the other hand, attempted to humanize Wilson, portraying him as a product of a difficult environment, a young man caught in a world of violence that he did not create. They argued against the narrative of a hardened killer, suggesting a more complex and troubled individual. But their efforts struggled to gain traction against the stark, undeniable facts of the case. The image of 2 police officers, executed while serving their city, was a powerful and enduring one. The prosecutors pressed their advantage, their closing arguments resonating with the pain and anger felt by the law enforcement community and the victims' families, who sat in the gallery, enduring every painful detail of the trial. In December 2006, the jury delivered its verdict, guilty on all counts. The finding of guilt was almost a foregone conclusion for many observers. The real drama was yet to come, in the penalty phase. In early 2007, that same jury was tasked with deciding Wilson's fate. Should he spend the rest of his life in prison, or should he be sentenced to death? After deliberating, they returned with their answer. Ronell Wilson would be sentenced to death by lethal injection. He became the first person to receive a federal death sentence in New York City since 1954. For the families of the detectives and a grieving police force, it felt like justice. But in the world of law, a verdict is rarely the final word. For 3 years, Ronell Wilson sat on federal death row, a symbol of the ultimate punishment for an ultimate crime. The families of his victims, and indeed much of the city, believed that justice had run its course. The legal system had spoken, delivering the harshest sentence possible. Yet, behind the scenes, Wilson's appellate lawyers were meticulously combing through every transcript, every motion, every word spoken during his trial. They were searching for a mistake, a legal flaw, a single thread that, if pulled, could unravel the entire sentence. And in 2010, they found one. It was a thread woven into the prosecutor's final remarks to the jury during the penalty phase of the trial. The issue was rooted in one of the most fundamental protections afforded to any defendant in the American justice system, the Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. A person on trial cannot be compelled to testify against themselves, and their silence cannot be used as evidence of guilt. During the sentencing, however, the prosecutor made a statement that crossed a critical line. The prosecutor argued that Wilson's choice not to take the stand and speak to the jury was a sign of his arrogance and lack of remorse. He suggested that Wilson, by not expressing sorrow for his actions, had forfeited his right to their mercy. It was a powerful and emotionally charged argument, but it was also, as the appeals court would later find, constitutionally improper. The United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit took up the case and agreed with Wilson's defense team. The court ruled that the prosecutor's comments amounted to serious misconduct. By essentially punishing Wilson for exercising his constitutional right not to testify, the prosecution had tainted the jury's decision-making process. The court could not be certain that the jury would have voted for the death penalty had they not heard those improper arguments. The ruling was a stunning reversal. It did not overturn Wilson's conviction. He was still guilty of the murders, but it vacated his death sentence. The case, the court ordered, must be sent back to the lower court for a new sentencing trial. The decision was a devastating blow to the families of detectives Nemarin and Andrews, and to the prosecution team. They would have to go through the entire ordeal of a penalty phase trial all over again. The wounds that had perhaps begun to scar over were torn open once more. For the public, it was a confusing and frustrating turn of events, a prime example of a legal technicality, overriding what seemed to be a just outcome. But for the legal system, it was a necessary correction, a reaffirmation that the rules and rights designed to ensure a fair trial apply to everyone, even those convicted of the most heinous crimes. And so, Ronell Wilson was moved from death row back to a federal detention center in Brooklyn, to await a new jury and a new fight for his life. As Ronell Wilson awaited his resentencing, he was held at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, a federal facility meant to be secure and impervious to the outside world. But inside its concrete walls, a new and scandalous chapter of his story was unfolding, one that would defy all logic and protocol. It involved a 29-year-old federal corrections officer named Nancy Gonzalez. A former U.S. Army member, Gonzalez was tasked with guarding some of the nation's most dangerous inmates. Yet she found herself drawn into a clandestine relationship with the very man who had murdered 2 police officers. What began with flirtatious notes and whispered conversations soon spiraled into a full-blown illicit affair. The relationship was a staggering breach of security and ethics. Gonzalez risked her career, her freedom, and her reputation for a man convicted of capital murder. She smuggled in contraband for him, and eventually their secret encounters became physical. The trysts took place in the shadows of the prison, in an activity room away from the most watchful eyes. It was a shocking betrayal of her duty, a line crossed that seemed incomprehensible to her colleagues and the public. Why would she do it? In later statements, Gonzalez would claim she was emotionally vulnerable at the time, and that she wanted to give Wilson something to live for, a sense of hope. and a legacy. She saw a man, not a monster, but prosecutors would later paint a much more manipulative picture. They discovered letters Wilson had written from his cell, letters that suggested a colder, more calculated motive. In one chilling note, he wrote, "I just need a baby before these pigs try to take my life." The words implied a cynical scheme, that fathering a child could be a strategic move, a way to engender sympathy from a new jury and avoid the death penalty a second time. Was Nancy Gonzalez a lovesick, vulnerable woman who fell for a charismatic inmate, or was she a pawn in a convicted killer's desperate game to save his own life? The truth was likely a complicated mix of both, a toxic cocktail of manipulation and misguided affection. The affair continued in secret for months, a ticking time bomb in the heart of the federal prison system. Wilson, it would later be revealed, was not exclusively devoted to Gonzalez. He was reportedly making romantic calls to 3 other women from the prison phones, juggling relationships from behind bars. The man who was supposed to be isolated and awaiting judgment on his life had, as one judge would later furiously remark, turned the jail into his personal fiefdom. The scandal was about to break, and when it did, it would add an explosive and bizarre twist to a case already filled with tragedy and legal drama, leaving everyone to wonder how such a thing could have possibly happened. The secret affair between Ronell Wilson and Nancy Gonzalez could not stay hidden forever. The bombshell dropped when Gonzalez discovered she was pregnant. The father was, without a doubt, the infamous cop killer she was paid to guard. The news sent shockwaves through the Bureau of Prisons and the United States Attorney's Office. The security breach was not just a minor infraction, it was, honestly, a catastrophic failure that had resulted in the creation of a new life under the most sordid circumstances imaginable. An internal investigation was immediately launched, and the full scope of the forbidden romance came to light. The consequences for Nancy Gonzalez were, well, swift and severe. She was arrested and charged with sexual abuse of a person in custody. The scandal became a public spectacle. During Wilson's resentencing proceedings, the prosecution presented the affair as the ultimate evidence of his manipulative character and his utter contempt for rules and authority. They showed the jury a grainy surveillance video from July 15, 2012. It captured a 2-minute tryst between Wilson and Gonzalez in the prison's activity room, a stark and undeniable piece of evidence. The footage, though brief, spoke volumes. It cemented the prosecution's narrative that Wilson was incapable of rehabilitation, a man who could bend others to his will and corrupt the very system designed to contain him, even while facing a potential death sentence. In March 2013, Nancy Gonzalez gave birth to a baby boy. She named him Justus. The irony of the name was, not lost on anyone involved in the case. Here was a child, an innocent life brought into the world as a direct result of a relationship that was the antithesis of justice. Gonzalez, facing her own legal peril, pleaded guilty. She told the court she felt lost and that Wilson had given her a sense of purpose. Her defense tried to portray her as a victim of his manipulation, a broken person who made a terrible mistake. But the court saw her as an officer of the law who had committed a profound betrayal of public trust. She was ultimately sentenced to a year and a day in prison. The existence of the child, Justus, became a central and deeply uncomfortable element in Wilson's ongoing legal battle. His defense lawyers now had a new, powerful argument to make against the death penalty. Executing Wilson would mean making his son fatherless. It was the very scenario prosecutors believed Wilson had engineered. The affair and the resulting child added a layer of human complexity and moral ambiguity to the case that was both tragic and, honestly, deeply unsettling. A story that began with the murder of 2 fathers had now produced another child, one who would grow up in the shadow of his father's crimes and his mother's scandal. With the scandal of the affair now public knowledge, the stage was set for Ronell Wilson's second sentencing trial. Federal prosecutors, more determined than ever, once again argued for the death penalty. They presented Wilson to the new jury, not just as the man who had executed 2 police officers, but as a master manipulator who continued to show a brazen disregard for any form of authority. The affair with Nancy Gonzalez became a cornerstone of their case. They argued it was proof that life in prison was not a sufficient punishment for Wilson. He could corrupt, he could harm, he could even create life from behind bars. Only the ultimate penalty, they argued, could ensure he would never manipulate or harm anyone again. The courtroom atmosphere was electric with tension. Prosecutors paraded a series of witnesses who testified to Wilson's ongoing defiance. They brought up a 2006 incident where, during a prison visit, he had received a sex act from a girlfriend, while his own mother and sister were in the same room. This, combined with the evidence of his affair with Gonzalez and the romantic calls to other women, was used to construct a portrait of a man utterly devoid of shame or remorse. They wanted the jury to see a predator, someone who viewed every person and every situation as something to be exploited for his own gratification and strategic advantage, a man for whom rules were merely suggestions to be ignored. Wilson's defense team faced an uphill battle. They could not deny the facts of the affair or the other prison infractions. Instead, they tried to reframe the narrative. They argued that these actions, while wrong, were not the actions of a cold, calculating monster, but of a deeply flawed and impulsive human being. They presented the affair as a desperate search for human connection in the face of death. They argued that the existence of his son, Justus, was now a powerful mitigating factor. They asked the jury to consider the life of the child, to choose life for the father so that the son would not be orphaned by an act of the state. It was a plea for mercy, an appeal to the jury's humanity. But the defense had another, more powerful legal argument they were preparing to deploy. It was an argument that would shift the entire focus of the case away from Wilson's actions and toward the very nature of his mind. This strategy wasn't about seeking mercy or forgiveness from the jury. It was a direct legal challenge based on a landmark Supreme Court precedent. They would argue that Ronell Wilson was, by legal definition, intellectually disabled. And if they could prove that, then under the Constitution of the United States, he could not be executed, no matter how terrible his crimes. The battle for his life was about to enter a new and final phase. The legal argument that would ultimately decide Ronell Wilson's fate hinged on the Eighth Amendment's prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment. In 2002, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Atkins v. Virginia that executing individuals with intellectual disabilities was unconstitutional. This set a legal standard, but the definition of intellectual disability remained a subject of intense debate in courtrooms across the country. Wilson's lawyers contended that he met this definition. They began to build a case not around the events of the murder or the prison affair, but around Wilson's entire life, from his troubled childhood to his performance on standardized tests, arguing that he possessed significant cognitive limitations. The defense presented a battery of experts, psychologists and educational specialists, who testified about Wilson's low IQ scores, which consistently hovered around the threshold for intellectual disability. They detailed his poor academic record, his struggles with basic reasoning, and his inability to function at a level expected for his age. They painted a picture of a man who suffered from adaptive deficits, meaning he lacked the practical and social skills necessary to navigate daily life independently. They argued that these were not excuses for his crimes, but rather clinical facts that, under the law, made him ineligible for the death penalty. It was a complex and nuanced argument, a world away from the raw emotion of the crime itself. Prosecutors fought back fiercely against this claim. They portrayed the intellectual disability argument as a desperate, 11th-hour fabrication, a cynical ploy to escape the ultimate punishment. They called their own experts who challenged the validity of the defense's assessments. They pointed to Wilson's actions as evidence of his cunning and street smarts. How could a man with a supposed intellectual disability orchestrate a complex gun deal, execute a plan to murder 2 officers, and then manipulate a corrections officer into a sexual relationship? They argued his actions demonstrated a clear ability to plan, deceive, and achieve his goals, hallmarks of a functioning mind, not a disabled one. The debate raged in the courtroom, a battle of experts and interpretations. The jury and the judge were left to sift through conflicting testimony, IQ scores, and psychological jargon. The central question was profound. Was Ronell Wilson a cunning sociopath, or was he a man whose cognitive impairments left him unable to fully grasp the consequences of his actions? The legal landscape shifted again in 2014 when the Supreme Court in Hall v. Florida clarified its position. The court ruled that a strict IQ score cutoff was not enough. Courts must also consider adaptive functioning and the standard error of measurement in IQ tests. This decision gave more weight to the arguments being made by Wilson's defense and set the stage for the final ruling. The final decision on Ronell Wilson's eligibility for execution rested not with a jury, but with the judge who had presided over the case from the beginning, Federal Judge Nicholas G. Garofis. He had been the one to sentence Wilson to death in 2007. He had expressed visceral outrage at the security lapses that allowed the affair with Nancy Gonzalez to happen. Now, he was tasked with weighing all the evidence presented on Wilson's intellectual capacity and applying the latest Supreme Court precedents. The fate of Ronell Wilson, after years of trials, appeals, and scandals, came down to this single momentous ruling. The courtroom waited, the families waited, and the city waited. On March 15, 2016, Judge Garaufis issued his decision. It was a thorough and meticulously reasoned 77-page opinion. In it, he permanently barred prosecutors from seeking the death penalty ever again. He ruled that Ronell Wilson was, in fact, intellectually disabled, and therefore constitutionally ineligible for execution. The judge acknowledged Wilson's IQ scores, but, following the guidance of Hall versus Florida, he placed significant emphasis on what he determined were Wilson's significant related and concurrent deficits in adaptive functioning. He cited Wilson's lifelong struggles with conceptual, social, and practical skills, concluding that these deficits were genuine and not a fabrication for the trial. Judge Garaufis made it clear that his ruling was not an exoneration or an excuse for Wilson's horrific crimes. He wrote with palpable disgust about the murders of detectives Nemirin and Andrews, calling them among the most cold-blooded and heinous in the city's long history. He did not downplay the severity of what Wilson had done, but, he explained, the Constitution places a limit on the state's power to punish, and that limit protects those with intellectual disabilities from the finality of a death sentence. His decision was a difficult application of law over emotion, a ruling bound by legal precedent rather than by public outrage or a desire for retribution. With the death penalty now permanently off the table, the only remaining sentence was life in prison, without the possibility of parole. For Ronell Wilson, the long legal battle for his life was finally over. He would spend the rest of his days behind the walls of a maximum security federal prison, likely the Supermax facility in Florence, Colorado, a place from which escape is virtually impossible, and human contact is severely limited. The finality of the sentence brought a close to one of the most tumultuous and high-profile capital cases in New York's recent history. The outcome, however, left many with a profound sense of unresolved conflict. The conclusion of the Ronell Wilson case left a complex and painful legacy in its wake. For the families of detectives James Nemirin and Rodney Andrews, the final sentence of life in prison felt like a profound injustice. They had endured over a decade of legal proceedings, a trial, a death sentence, an appeal, a scandal, and a resentencing, only to see the man who murdered their loved ones spared the ultimate penalty on what many perceived as a technicality. Their grief was compounded by the frustration that the system they believed in had, in their eyes, failed to deliver true justice. Their loss remained the central, immovable tragedy of the entire saga. The case also sent ripples through the law enforcement community, serving as a stark reminder of the dangers of undercover work and the deep-seated animosity that can exist between the police and the communities they serve. The brazenness of the murders, followed by Wilson's ability to corrupt a federal officer from within a secure facility, created a sense of institutional vulnerability. It led to reviews of security protocols within the Bureau of Prisons and fueled a continuing debate about the effectiveness and security of the penal system. The name Ronell Wilson became synonymous not only with cop killing, but also with a shocking breach of the very order he had sought to defy. From a legal standpoint, the case became a significant precedent, particularly in the application of the death penalty in the modern era. It highlighted the immense difficulty of securing and upholding a capital sentence, especially in states without a history of recent executions. The successful appeal based on prosecutorial misconduct and the final ruling on intellectual disability underscored the rigorous constitutional safeguards that surround capital punishment. The case serves as a powerful case study in legal ethics, appellate procedure, and the evolving standards of what constitutes cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment, influencing legal strategies in capital cases for years to come. Ultimately, the story of Ronell Wilson is a somber tale of crime and its far-reaching consequences. It's a story of lives lost, families shattered, and a justice system strained to its limits. It is a narrative filled with violence, scandal, and intricate legal maneuvering, leaving behind a child who will forever be tied to its infamy. The case closed not with a sense of triumphant justice or clear moral resolution, but with a quiet, somber acknowledgement of the profound and enduring pain inflicted one cold night on a Staten Island street, a pain that no court ruling could ever truly erase. The legal questions may have been answered, but the echoes of the tragedy remain.